Chapter 7 begins Marx's analysis of production under capitalism. He explains how labor transforms raw materials into commodities, creating new value in the process. It's in this chapter that Marx differentiates between labor as a productive activity and labor under capitalism as a process of valorization, or creating value. Marx starts by describing the general labor process, which exists in all societies. Humans engage with nature using tools and effort to create use values, which are objects that satisfy human needs. Marx writes, open quote, "Labor is, first of all, a process between man and nature, a process by which man, through his own actions, mediates, regulates, and controls the metabolism between himself and nature." End quote. For example, a carpenter transforms raw wood into a table. This process involves three key elements. 1. The worker, who provides physical and mental effort. 2. The means of production, which are the tools and materials used in production. And 3. The object of labor, that is, the raw materials being transformed, for example, wood into a table. Under capitalism, the labor process doesn't just produce use values, it produces value. Specifically, it produces more value than was originally invested in the production process. This transformation is called valorization. And here's how it works. 1. A capitalist buys raw materials and pays for labor power. 2. The worker uses those materials to produce goods with a value greater than the combined cost of labor and materials. And 3. That difference is surplus value, which the capitalist claims as profit. Marx explains, open quote, "The process of valorization transforms money into capital," end quote. This is why the labor process under capitalism is exploitative. The worker creates more value than they are paid for, and the capitalist takes the surplus. Marx emphasizes that production under capitalism has a twofold nature. For one, there is the creation of use values, where the worker produces goods that are useful and satisfy a human need. And secondly, the creation of value. The worker also produces value that is appropriated by the capitalist. For example, in a shoe factory, the worker produces shoes, which are use values. Also, the value of the shoes includes both the cost of materials and the surplus value added by the worker's labor. This twofold nature highlights the alienation in capitalist production. The worker's labor is not just creating useful things, but also fueling the capitalist profit. Marx writes, open quote, "The process of production under capitalism is both a labor process and a process of creating value." So, to quickly summarize that shorter chapter, we learned in chapter 7 that Marx examines the labor process and how it transforms into the valorization process under capitalism. He explains that production has a twofold nature. For one, it creates use values, which are useful goods, and secondly, it creates exchange value, which is the market value, where the capitalist generates surplus value. While labor produces useful things in any society, under capitalism it also produces surplus value, which we know now is the source of capitalist profit. The key insight here is that workers create more value than they are paid for, and this difference is captured by the capitalist as surplus value. This exploitation is the defining feature of capitalist production and the engine of capital accumulation. In Chapter 8, Marx introduces two key components of capital in the production process. 1. Constant capital, and 2. Variable capital. These categories explain how value flows and grows under capitalism. Constant capital refers to the value of the means of production, so raw materials, machinery, tools, etc. This value doesn't change during production. It is transferred unchanged to the final product. For example, the value of wood used to make a table is carried over into the table. And then the same applies to the wear and tear on the tools and machines. Marx writes, open quote, "Constant capital does not create new value. It merely transfers its own value to the new product." End quote. Variable capital, on the other hand, is the value invested in labor power, so the wages that are paid to workers. Unlike constant capital, variable capital creates new value during the production process. So, for example, a worker might be paid £100 in wages but produces goods worth £300. The £200 difference is the surplus value, which then forms the source of capitalist profit. Marx explains, open quote, "It is the capital laid out in labor power that creates surplus value." End quote. The distinction between constant and variable capital is essential to understanding capitalist production. Constant capital only transfers value, while variable capital expands it. Capitalists aim to maximize variable capital productivity while minimizing its costs, driving the relentless pursuit of profit. This focus on squeezing more value out of workers defines the exploitative nature of capitalism. Marx writes, open quote, "The rate of surplus value is determined by the proportion of variable capital that becomes surplus." In Chapter 9 of Das Kapital, Marx dives deeper into the rate of surplus value, which is a critical measure of capitalist exploitation. This chapter explains how surplus value is calculated, the relationship between necessary labor and surplus labor, and how these dynamics define the capitalist mode of production. Marx begins this chapter by distinguishing between necessary labor and surplus labor, two fundamental concepts for understanding the rate of surplus value. For one, there is necessary labor, and this is the proportion of the working day where the worker produces value equivalent to their wages. In other words, it's the labor time required to cover the worker's cost of living. And two, there is surplus labor. This is the portion of the working day where the worker produces value beyond the cost of their wages. This is surplus value, and this is what the capitalist keeps as profit. Marx writes, open quote, "The surplus labor of the worker over and above the necessary labor time costs the capitalist nothing, yet it creates surplus value for him." Imagine a worker's day split into two halves. In the first half, they work to earn their wages. In the second half, they work purely to generate profit for their employer. In the next section, Marx introduces a crucial formula that expresses the rate of surplus value, a mathematical representation of exploitation under capitalism. This formula helps us understand how much surplus labor workers perform compared to the labor they're actually paid for. The formula for the rate of surplus value is written as surplus value divided by variable capital. So S prime equals S divided by V. Here the S stands for surplus value, which is the value created by the worker that exceeds the cost of their wages, and V stands for variable capital, the wages paid to the worker. In plain terms, this formula measures how much unpaid labor a worker performs relative to how much they are paid. Marx writes, open quote, "The rate of surplus value is an exact expression of the degree of exploitation of labor power by capital." End quote. Marx then emphasizes that the length of the working day is central to determining the rate of surplus value. The capitalist aims to extend surplus labor time without increasing wages, while workers struggle to limit their working hours. There are two main strategies for increasing surplus value. One, by extending the working day. So by increasing the hours worked, the capitalist can increase the surplus labor time directly. And secondly, there's intensifying labor. By increasing productivity, the capitalist can extract more value in the same amount of time. Marx writes, open quote, "The capitalist is constantly trying to prolong the working day, while the worker resists this encroachment," end quote. This struggle over time is not just economic. It's also a fight over life, health, and dignity. The rate of surplus value is not just a technical ratio. It reveals the exploitative core of capitalism. A higher rate means that workers are being squeezed harder, with more surplus labor extracted for the same wages. It shows that the capitalist profit doesn't come from innovation, luck, or market magic. It comes directly from the unpaid labor of workers. Marx writes, open quote, "Surplus value is not the result of some trick in exchange. It arises from the consumption of labor power itself," end quote. This understanding demystifies capitalist profit, exposing it as systemic exploitation rather than fair exchange. Finally, in this chapter, Marx explains that the rate of surplus value isn't just an economic issue, it's deeply moral and political. It reflects the power dynamics between workers and capitalists. It also shows how economic relations under capitalism are social and political relations of power and control. This chapter reveals that exploitation isn't a bug in capitalism that we must fix urgently, it's a feature baked into the system at its core. Marx concludes, open quote, "The secret of surplus value lies in the difference between the value of labor power and the value created by labor power in use," end quote. So what did we learn in chapter 9? In chapter 9, Marx explains the rate of surplus value as a measure of worker exploitation under capitalism. Through the relationship between necessary labor and surplus labor, and the formula S divided by V, Marx reveals how the working day becomes a battleground for control over labor time and profit. This chapter demystifies profit, showing it as the direct result of unpaid labor time. And in the next chapter, we'll be diving into how the capitalist system organizes labor time to maximize surplus value extraction. In chapter 10, The Working Day, Marx dives into one of the most intense battlegrounds of capitalism, time itself. This chapter explores how the capitalist tries to extend and intensify the working day to extract maximum surplus value, while workers fight to limit their hours and protect their own well-being. Marx begins by asking a seemingly simple question. How long should the working day be? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. It should last as long as necessary to produce value that covers the workers' wages, their necessary labor, and generates profit for the capitalist, their surplus labor. But there is a problem. For the capitalist, there are no natural limits to the working day. Every extra hour worked is an opportunity to extract more surplus value. Marx writes, open quote, "Capital is dead labor, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks," end quote. The worker, on the other hand, has physical, emotional, and social needs. They must eat, sleep, and have time for family, rest, and leisure. This sets up a fundamental conflict, where 1. The capitalist wants to maximize the working hours, but 2. The worker wants to limit them. Marx explains that the length of the working day is not a natural given. It's a result of struggle. Historically, capitalists have pushed for longer hours, while workers have always fought for shorter, more humane hours. Marx documents horrifying examples from industrial England, where workers were forced to work 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Also, there were children working in dangerous conditions for these endless hours. These extreme conditions sparked resistance. Workers organized strikes, they formed unions, and they demanded legal reforms to shorten the working day. Marx writes, open quote, "The establishment of a normal working day is the result of centuries of struggle between capitalist and laborer." End quote. This fight wasn't about abstract numbers, it was about survival, health, and human rights. Historically, capitalists have used several strategies to extend the working day. Firstly, there is the outright lengthening of hours, which is just increasing daily or weekly working hours without increasing wages. Secondly, there was overtime, which is the demanding of additional hours beyond the standard working day. And three, there was shift work, introducing multiple shifts to keep factories running 24/7. All of these strategies aim to maximize surplus labor time without raising the cost of wages. Marx writes, open quote, "Capital takes no account of the health and longevity of the worker unless society forces it to do so." End quote. For capital, the worker is just another input, cost to be minimized, and a resource to be drained. The demand for the 8-hour workday became a central rallying cry for the labor movement of the time. The famous slogan emerged, open quote, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will, end quote. Workers recognized that limiting the working day wasn't just about rest, it was about reclaiming their humanity from a system that treated them like machines. Through organized resistance, strikes, and legislation, workers eventually forced governments to introduce laws regulating the working day. However, Marx warns us that these victories are never permanent. Capital is always searching for new ways to circumvent these limits, whether through unpaid overtime, informal labor, or technological intensification. Marx writes, open quote, "The worker's time is the capitalist space for growth." End quote. In chapter 10, to round up, Marx shows us that the struggle over the working day is the heart of the capitalist system's contradictions. Time is not just money, it's life. Capital seeks to stretch time to extract more surplus value, while workers fight to reclaim their hours, their health, their dignity, and their human rights with shorter working days. This chapter is a powerful reminder that every gain made by workers, every law protecting working hours, was won through struggle and resistance. So, before moving on to part 4, let's quickly recap the key insights from part 3, which was the production of absolute surplus value. Here, Marx analyzes how surplus value is extracted from workers through the lengthening and structuring of the working day. So in chapter 7, Marx introduced the labour process and the valorization process, showing how human labour creates use values, but also generates surplus value under the capitalist system. In chapter 8, he broke down capital into constant capital, being raw materials, tools, machinery, and variable capital, which is wages. Only variable capital creates new value. Constant capital merely redistributes it. In chapter 9, the rate of surplus value was explained using the formula S divided by V, showing how the exploitation of workers can be mathematically expressed and worked out. In chapter 10, Marx explored the working day as a battleground between capitalists and workers, where the struggle over time reflects the fundamental conflict of capitalism.